Enrica Piccardo. So as you know, she's a leader in the field of applied linguistics and language education, but she comes to us with a rich background as a language teacher. She has extensive experience in second and foreign language teaching, as well as teacher education and research, including in the field of German language, English language, and French language. And she also has a few other languages sprinkled into her plurilingual repertoire. And we'll let you guess at those another time. She's collaborated with the Council of Europe for over 10 years, and she is the co-author of the newly released CEFR companion volume. She's coordinated various international projects funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. You may have heard of some of these projects or even been involved with them. They include Linguistic and Cultural Diversity Reinvented and Quali CEFR, comparing the CEFR use in Canada and in Switzerland. She's also received funding from the Council of Europe, and you may have heard of some of the projects, including Encouraging the Culture of Evaluation Among Professionals and Quali Matrix, a quality assurance matrix for CEFR use. Her research includes a focus on plurilingualism, emotions, and creativity in language education and assessment, and its role in curriculum. The monograph that you'll be hearing about today has grown out from a lot of this work, and in particular, a monograph that you can find online called From Communicative to Action-Oriented, a research pathway published in 2014. That is now currently in use with teacher education in Canada and beyond. So other people are also lucky to have Enrica. She does travel to other parts of the world and present her work on many different topics. And we've got one more exciting thing to look forward to, her handbook that will be appearing with Routledge called the Handbook of Plurilingualism. So, yay! Brian has no less a prestigious profile as a researcher in language education who's collaborated extensively with international organizations, particularly the Council of Europe. He's been a teacher, project coordinator, course director, development manager, and researcher. In his own doctoral thesis, The Development of a Common Framework Scale of Language Proficiency, published actually in 2000 by Peter Lang, he developed the levels and descriptors of the CEFR. He then co-authored the CEFR itself, the Prototype European Language Portfolio, and the Manual for Relating Examinations to the CEFR, as well as equals CEFR core inventories for English and French. So we're in front of two powerhouses. He's recently been working on this CEFR in practice and also another book on language course planning, published by two prestigious houses, including Cambridge and Oxford University Presses. Enrica and Brian have collaborated on this volume, which you can see and learn more about today. It provides the background to the current shifts towards a more action-oriented and action-based teaching, which is growing significantly on the ground in language education as a means to providing, these are key words, motivating, realistic, and project-based teaching. It's about time. I've been waiting for this for 40 years. They started talking about communicative competence in the mid-70s when I was becoming a teacher, and I was thinking, it's right around the corner. We're going to get there. And it's 2020, and maybe we're getting there now. So you'll hear about how the book provides a theorization of the approach, explains its distinct characteristics, and shows a way in which, over the last 30 years, different complementary theories and bottom-up experimentation have enabled the development of an innovative, holistic form of language education. So, let's give a warm welcome to our two co-authors, Enrica and Brian.
you very much for coming, everybody. And I hope that you learned something from what we have to tell you. The first question really is why? Why this book? Why a book on the action-oriented approach? And I mean, there are three reasons really. The action-oriented approach as an expression has been around for a while. It's been around for 20 years. It comes from the Common European Framework of Reference, the CFR, which was published in 2001. And as Antoinette said, there's been a lot of experimentation and bottom-up development, but no theorization of what's going on. And to be honest, little practical guidance. And so that's why we decided to write the book. In terms of where it comes from with the CFR sees language learners as social agents. So agency, the ability to yourself decide if you're working in a project, how is this project going to develop? Room to maneuver is the central issue in the CFR and in the action-oriented approach. So the key aspect of what social agents do is co-construct meaning in real-life-oriented tasks, and while they're engaging in communicative activities like reception or interaction or production, and in doing that they draw on their competencies, both linguistic competencies, language competencies, linguistic, pragmatic, sociolinguistic, but also general competencies like emotional competencies, socio-cultural competencies, intercultural competencies, etc., and using communicative strategies. And then in turn, by doing that, they further develop these competencies and strategies. That's the fundamental model, if you like, the theoretical model. Bottom-up experimentation, we mentioned, and we also mentioned this project that we had comparing the implementation of the CFR in Canada and in Switzerland. That was a project of Enrica's, which I was co-applicant on because I live in Switzerland. And here are some comments about this. So if you look at the blue, when I ask teachers to explain what action-oriented is, they can't always do that. So they can't say what it is. But when I observe them, I see they do it. We are filming our classes now for a promotional video, etc., etc. The approach is very learner-oriented. The teacher is there to guide, but learners are very active. Use lots of games, project work, online classrooms where they can prepare projects together and present them in class. And the material we use is very authentic. It's important for us that the situations are all realistic. Okay, so this is someone in Canada talking about the courses which they are running. But you can compare that to other comments, like, I think the adoption of the action-oriented approach in Canada is very low, mostly because of knowledge. Not many teachers in this province have a lot of working knowledge of the CFR and action-oriented approaches. Someone else. Teachers need more exposure to this, the action-oriented approach, because it's not addressed in in-service training. Or don't assume you know, because the action-oriented approach is not an easy concept. So, as we were saying, there is a lack of theorization, and this is what I'm going to pass over to Enrica to tell you a little about.
So, with the publication, the first publication online of the CFR companion volume, this action-oriented approach that was just a very dense and almost incomprehensible paragraph in the first edition of the CFR was unpacked, and it became much more visible and possible to be further developed. And as Antoinette mentioned, and then Brian mentioned before, I wrote some time ago a little guide that was really just for practitioners to explain the move from communicative to action-oriented. And to my astonishment, that was done for the Ministry of Education of Ontario for FSL teaching. So kind of quite specific, although it existed in English and French. But the very fact that it existed in English and French attracted a lot of interest, and we see from the analytics that this little publication is used across Canada and in Europe and beyond. So that shows that there was a need for teachers to be guided on this move, and that was what sparked our motivation to go further with the book. So I wanted to go with a little bit historically with you. If we see how historically we conceived language learning, well, we were still stuck, and many textbooks and curricula are unfortunately still stuck with the 4 skills: listening, reading, speaking, and writing, and the tests even worse. They are neatly separating this aspect. We talk about the speaker and hearer, and the code was focused on accuracy and fluency, and the idea that you mobilize the learned language. That was the very traditional view, but unfortunately, as I said, it's not so far from the reality, unfortunately, in several contexts. But we moved away from that already, and the CFR in that respect was a milestone because it really pushed this change by already saying that you don't mobilize just your learned language, but you mobilize your linguistic resources. So it was much more open because it's not just what you have learned formally, but what all the resources that you can have. And it stressed, with adding interaction and mediation, it stressed the social use of language, and it started to introduce the notion of social agent. But the most important part that people still don't necessarily acknowledge or even recognize is that it moved away from a model based on the 4 skills into 4 modes of communication: reception, production, interaction, and mediation. And each of these modes of communication comes in written and oral form, and we know that with the multiliteracy turn, it also comes with other forms, and not just written and oral. So it was a big shift. But the notion of social agent was still kind of timid there, like announced but not developed, and so was mediation, announced but not developed. So it's later and more recently that with the publication of the companion volume, well, the notion of mediation found really its blooming and development, and so we have the conceptual model that is underlying the action-oriented approach. So the user-learner become a social agent in the real sense of the word. The code is no longer focusing just on this dichotomous view of accuracies versus fluency. That was kind of a straitjacket, but we talk and we consider the complexity of the message as well. And this social agent is not just interacting with others, it's co-constructing meaning. So it's a process that is really shared, and in doing that, they mobilize not only their linguistic competencies, as we had before, but they mobilize all their linguistic and cultural resources, plurilingual and pluricultural competencies, and the general competencies. So what is not linguistic, what is general, what is you develop in your life. So what we did in the book was to try and go through this development to see how things moved. This is the table of content of the specification of one chapter. Because, as we know in language education, we don't throw things away, we kind of build. It's a kind of archaeological site or a kind of palimpsest where you build on previous theorization, etc. And so we tried to see what was worth keeping and what was not, and what had informed future thinking, until we got to what really covers the action-oriented approach. And you can see, if you read it from the 1st to the 9th, that there is this movement towards complexity and towards a broadened view, a more broad view of theories in language education. So, of course, we won't cover them all, but we will focus a little bit in this more recent theorization of language education and language learning. So if we think of the development, we really see that we've gone from a linear to a complex vision, because traditionally communication was, and language learning were linear. You learn to communicate the message, you learn in the class, and then you will apply outside of the class. And you learn language and culture plus culture as if they were two separate things, but they are not. They are totally intricately embedded one into the other, inextricably embedded. So this is the move we have seen, and it's okay. We said from linear to complex, but we know that precisely this idea of language plus culture, you learn before, you apply later, is not possible, because the reality is much more complex than that. And what we see in our life and exchange and classroom communication and outside is just the tip of the iceberg. And we know that with the action-oriented approach, these aspects, both communication and language learning, are complex because you learn to construct and co-construct meaning, and you co-construct communication, you share and you co-construct, and the class becomes a real social context. It's not like you prepare yourself in the class to do something later, but it's a real social context, and you use all your linguistic and cultural repertoires in a way that is not, it's not possible to tearing them apart. So in reality, if we consider this iceberg, what is under the tip of language use is really an area where language is an emergent phenomenon, because underneath there is much more. So there are linguistic and cultural trajectories. Each of us has had very complex linguistic and cultural trajectories, including people who think, oh no, I'm not that complex. I lived in the same town all my life. I was born there, lived there, never moved. But no, you came in contact with many other people, many other cultures. You read the novels. You did all sorts of exchange with other cultures. So linguistic and cultural trajectories, socialization into communities. We're not isolated, we live in communities, and this changes us. The social experiences are important. Our agency, how much we exert of this agency. So our plurilingualism, which, as I wrote in one publication, we are all plurilingual. We should start from that perspective, revert the idea that only some people who have several languages are plurilingual. It's an attitude more, because we have different variation of the same language, at the very least. And then this idea of co-constructing meaning, of languaging and plurilanguaging. So language becomes a verb, no longer a noun. So the action-oriented approach tries to capture all that, and these key points are plurilingualism, mediation, and action orientation. So in another chapter, we try to show how we move towards this other view of where change and balance and creativity are important, are not a negative. Unbalance is always in our society seen as something negative, or something that you're not so balanced. We always strive to be more balanced. But unbalanced is a positive thing, because it's where you move, it's where you understand the things, it's where you change. And this new vision of culture, plurilingualism, mediation, and this idea that plurilingualism and pluriculturalism are linked to an inclusive education for all. So, if we just to remind to some people who may not be so familiar with the term plurilingualism, but I'm sure with the concept they are, because some scholars use multilingualism and they mean plurilingualism. but we prefer the different, the two terms. So plurilingualism is an uneven and changing competence in which the user learner's resource in one language or variety may be very different in nature to those of one in another. And those plurilinguals, or we all, have a single interrelated repertoire that they combine with the general competencies and various strategies to accomplish tasks. And there we go, we are towards this idea of tasks, of action-oriented tasks. But before getting there, let's have a little moment on mediation, because mediation is what serves the poor purpose of making sense of this vision. Basically, it was also during the development of all the descriptors for mediation that we kind of understood much more what is plurilingualism, because this idea that you mediate all the time at different levels becomes center stage. And in fact, we know from different theories and different other studies that through mediation we can reconceptualize language as an activity, as an emergent dynamic process of shared meaning, which creates and transforms itself through interaction of individuals with their environment, as a complex dynamic system, as socialization in communities of practice, and a process that allows overcoming separation between individuals and culture. So language serves different mediation purposes at the end of the day, and it creates a plurilingual and pluricultural space for communication and learning, reduces those tensions and affective blocks, builds bridges towards the other, the new, help to construct and co-construct the meaning, and of course what was already there in the initial definition of mediation that we had in 2001, it also helps to pass on information, simplify, elaborate, illustrate, and adapt. But this is the kind of more current view that existed until like 2 decades ago of mediation. But mediation is much more than that. And then there were the last two, this passing on information and acting as an intermediary, which of course are still there, but there is a lot of mediation that is intrapersonal as well, and also kind of adding to this dimension. So our book is theoretical for one part, but not theoretical in the sense of impossible to read. It's theoretical because it tries to theorize also for not only for scholars but also for practitioners. And as we firmly believe, and we have had this experience, long experience of being teachers, that you don't do stuff just for scholars and never to reach the practitioners in education. So the idea is that you can use this action-oriented class in everyday class, action-oriented approach in everyday class. And this is not impossible. And so our book moves also to practice towards the end. And I let Brian continue.
So it's not mission impossible, but it does require a new approach. And I mean, there are 3 main aspects of this new approach. One is which the CFR has sort of propagates, is the idea of transparency of objectives and assessment. So you need to have a coherent system of where you have an alignment. It's called constructive alignment between your learning aims, the teaching program, curriculum, and the actual teaching, and the assessment, that they're all on the same, in the same language, they're doing the same thing. And because otherwise it's not going to work. You have to have that all lined up nicely. And then the idea that when you're doing some kind of learning unit or learning module, that it involves at some stage real-life tasks, or real-life oriented tasks. And it's this strategic and autonomous agentive decision making. That's the third element. Learners need to have room to maneuver. They need elbow room. Language learning and language teaching, language learning traditionally, it goes right back to behaviorism when when the learners were not allowed to say anything that was not kind of repeating something. And there was actually even a phase when the teachers were not allowed to say anything which was not scripted. We think we've left all of that behind, but in fact, the ghost of behaviorism is still there, right, all of these years later. So it's an attempt to move completely away from that. So what the AOA, what the action-oriented approach and mediation is all about, using one or more languages to complete an integrated task based on some kind of believable scenario in which you make sense of input. You choose, you find, you research some input and make sense of it, which is reception. And then you collaborate in your group with other people in order to discuss how you're going to go about this process of what you're going to create, and what materials people have found which can be fed into, what sources people have found, information that can be fed into the final product. So you collaborate together, and that's interaction. And then the product, you create some kind of artifact. There is some concrete result of all of this. So the interaction is motivated. It's not aimless. One of the problems with the communicative approach is that an awful lot of the interaction which goes on is quite literally aimless. It's very nice, but it's aimless. Whereas here, this has aims in two senses. It has aims because the whole thing is based upon transparent objectives expressed as can-do statements. And it has aims in that the students have an aim in the task, that they are producing something. They are creating an artifact, which could be, it could be your poster, it could be these Jim Cummins identity text type of thing, or it could be a video, it could be a scrapbook, it could be all sorts. It could be a program, presentation, all sorts of things. And in doing that, the key is to use relevant, authentic materials, which are preferably local, have some resonance locally, and to do so creatively, moving away from a linear view of learning, as Enrica was talking about, when you haven't got the language to express something, or the teacher is going around to help students to get the language that they need to do this, and obviously making a note of what perhaps not all of them are able to do in order to teach it consciously in a reflection phase later. And in all of this process, to becoming aware of the fact that you use strategies not just as a deficit strategy. I can't think of this word, therefore I compensate with another word. But that you plan, execute, monitor, and correct what you're doing. You plan what you're doing, you execute it, you monitor how it's going, and then you self-correct. This is a strategic approach to life, the universe, and everything, and belongs in language learning. And then finally, as a teacher, you have to think in terms of levels when you're choosing these tasks and these scenarios and all that. What is it reasonable for me to expect from these students at this level? You should, because there's no point giving people a mission impossible. It has to be something which you know that they're going to be able to do with a little bit of a push and a shove and some help. Scaffolding. So, the key tenets, this is rather a wordy slide, and I hope you can read it at the back. Can you read it at the back? Just about. Good, thank you very much. But it does try to get everything on one slide. So it's a good slide. So the key tenets of the action-oriented approach. The first thing is a concept of backwards design. The idea of, instead of what was called forwards design, which is plodding through the language from what people think is a simple structure like the present simple to complex structures. Plod, 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 and everybody follows exactly the same path. Instead of that, backwards design is, what do these people need to do? This group of undergraduate students, or immigrants, or 7-year-olds, what do they actually need the language for? So what are the aims? And then to define these with can-do statements, and then work backwards from that to create the curriculum and do the teaching. Secondly, acceptance of complexity, as I was saying. The whole thing is complex. It's if you oversimplify things and chop in the 1960s, it was very much the fashion to chop everything into little pieces and to then think that, well, people will be able to put it all together. We now realize we see where we are with, scientific research, medicines, climate, there's all sorts of disasters being caused by people chopping things up into little bits and not looking at the way in which everything interacts in a complex dynamic system. Then agency. The students need to be able to decide themselves, to some extent, depending on the age, decide themselves how to go about the task, how to go about accompanying it, which sources to use, how to find new sources, what kind of product are they going to produce. They have to have choices and investment, but to get buy-in. And one of the things that's remarkable in the task-based approach is when you look at the tasks which people use, they very, very rare, okay, Van den Brand, and there is a certain school that is a bit more creative, but in general, they are remarkably constrained tasks, where the students the whole time are being told what they have to do. Then co-construction of meaning through the collaborating together, mediating concepts, explaining things to each other, asking people to think something through or to express something more clearly, or to see where that leads us, or to build on what another person said, and facilitating communication, acting as an intermediary, creating the kind of conditions for positive work, the affective side of things. And then authenticity and credibility, which we mentioned already, the real life scenarios and materials. And then a really important point, the culminating task. Everything has to work towards this task where they produce something, which could be over a period of lessons. Then where the artifact. And then after all of that, there needs to be, and also during the process, some kind of reflection at some point to increase language awareness. There needs to be it's ideal if there is a pluricultural or intercultural focus at some point during the whole thing, and that learners are allowed, there are phases in which learners are allowed to integrate all their different languages. The issue with a plurilingual approach is that it shouldn't just be a free-for-all. You have to define what the language policy is for each stage of a process. So people should be searching for materials in all the languages they know, obviously. If they're doing a project on something, it doesn't make sense to say, we are only going to use resources in English because this is an English class. And you use all the resources you can find. And in the discussion, it may be that you allow in the collaboration phase that you discuss, that you allow them to use all of their linguistic resources because of all their creativity, but you want the final product in a particular language, or vice versa, that you want the final product in all the languages they can think of. So the point is that there are all sorts of variations of the idea of using combining the idea of using multiple languages with the idea that we are actually here to learn French. And there are lots of different ways of doing it. And then the idea that there's the idea of feedback, but there's also the idea of feed forward, that you have an iterative approach, that people, instead of repeating exactly the same thing, you give people tasks of a similar type, so they get better at doing this type of thing as you move forwards. Because self-efficacy is a very important concept related to agency. Self-efficacy is kind of an image of yourself being successful. So if you've been successful once, you're more likely to believe you'll be successful next time and you'll try. So that's the basic concept of self-efficacy, and that's what you want students to have this self-image of themselves as self-efficacious. And then finally, assessment and self-assessment of outcomes in terms of their language, but also in terms of how did it go? How was the task? Should we do it differently next time? Is there some bits you didn't like? So that's the attempt to get the whole thing on one piece of paper. And it's more than just task-based language teaching, as we mentioned once or twice. And there are a few key differences. The task projects are based on a multi-phase or multi-task scenario. It's not just one task, it's a whole series of tasks, some of which may be very traditional, others of which will involve different phases, of reception phase, an interaction phase, a production phase, etc. And this, in a scenario, learners are themselves, the fourth point down, learners are themselves, they are not pretending to be somebody else. There is no role play. If the scenario is set in a particular context, it's possible that they may be the town planners, but you don't tell them what the town planners are supposed to say, or what opinion they're supposed to have, and the whole thing. In other words, it may be that they are being themselves, and they may be being given some kind of social role in the process, but that the task does not tell them what to think, or what ideas they should be having. They develop that themselves. So the scenario is realistic, real-world oriented, and related to the can-do objectives. The tasks are creative, so they actually have to produce. They actually produce something, and it gives them room to bring in their creativity, not something that is too restrictive. And that they have. And what that means is they have agency. They have full agency to decide things. For example, to decide how they approach the project, to decide how to divide up jobs and responsibilities, to decide who is going to do what, and to seek and choose particular source material, and in designing their product. Now, this doesn't mean that the teacher does nothing. It just means that it's a change of role for the teacher. First of all, the teacher is going to have to give input, language input, at some point. It may be that it's in building up towards a culminating task. It may be that it's while they're working on the culminating task, or you feed in the language, and it's very likely that you will have some kind of language clinic afterwards, where people discuss the new language which they've come across, and you have them do conventional exercises to bang home this new language, and also transfer it to realistic situations of themselves. And the second point there about training. All of this involves group work. You can't expect that students automatically know what group work is supposed to be, or how group work functions. So they do need some training in how groups operate. What are the roles? How do you behave? How do you react if someone starts behaving in an unacceptable manner, or if someone is not taking part? Students need some, or especially younger students, need some conscious training on how to work in groups for the whole thing to work. And then obviously the teacher supports groups during the process and gives feedback later. So, in terms of working with a scenario, chapter 7 in the book is all about scenarios. We won't go into this into detail, but it's the idea of planning a scenario, selecting and using the descriptors, selecting the resources, fostering a plurilingual attitude, and then assessment as a monitoring and assessing with the can-do statements as you go through, and then reflecting at the end. In the book there are appendices with 3 radically different types of scenarios from 3 different projects. One is from the Linked Deer project, one is from which was mentioned before, that's this linguistic and cultural diversity reinvented. One is from another Canadian project, the Synergies project, isn't it? The Synergies project, which is to do with immigrants. And the third one is from the Equals core inventories, which were mentioned before, of which the French one is very good, but which I'm not so proud of the English one now. That was 10 years ago. So there we are, really. Thank you very much for your attention, and we'll leave you with the contents list so you can see. If you've got very good eyesight, you can see what the book actually has in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you. And we have, as it is a discussion, so we have time to discuss things a little bit now, and then in a more social way around some sandwiches, some food that we have for later. So first, let's have a little bit of exchange. If there are any questions, comments, remarks that you would like to ask, and if for those. for those that are connected over Zoom, just unmute your mic and just ask, and we will listen. Hear you.
Yeah, I have a question. Why do you think, what are the reasons for the action-oriented approach to not be as widely kind of welcomed and applied in classrooms still?
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is hindering teachers or classrooms?
That's the question.
Yeah.
What do you think? Yeah.
Yeah, no,
Because
that's
this is how
very...
we open the conversation, right? And
Yeah.
as someone who teaches at university, I see that as well. We're not what we wish we were. So why do you think that is?
Well, it's, I can start. It's something that we discuss in the class also quite a lot, because teachers very often have a very strict imposed curriculum. And the conditions are sometimes really this idea that if you have everything decided before, it's really very linear. You will apply this week, you will do that, and the following week you will do the other. And so this is one of the main problems of implementing an action-oriented approach, because too much really depends on the pressure that is on the teacher. However, there is, even when this is not the case, and I mean, in that case, there's still a little bit that can be done. It's always what I say to my students. It's not that because you are in a very strict environment that you can't maneuver a little bit, but for sure, not much, depending. I'm thinking of some students that tell me that they have an English-only policy, and even when a student say just one single word in another language, it's kind of punished or signaled. So this is a big issue. But even when there is not this kind of straitjacket, there is still a little bit of fear of letting things go and help the students and accept that the students have this agency. In my opinion, because there is still two problems. There is still this idea that what you have taught is what they have learned. So this mix between input and intake. Because I've explained that, because I've done that, the students will know that. And this is a big misunderstanding. And the other, I've just forgotten. There were two things. Well, it will come back.
I'll start with two contradictory points. One is that the teachers are very bad at doing nothing. And teachers very quickly get a bad conscience, feel bad. It's like people who can't tolerate silence. You know, it's that issue. That students always take a little longer than you expect in order to get started. Right? First of all, I mean, you can be doing things other than interrupting. If you set up group work, then you should allow the group work to just happen, and you wander around and intervene when it's necessary. Now, it's necessary if someone is misbehaving. If a group has misunderstood everything, or if they have decided to go off on a completely different direction, which you decide is not appropriate. Right? Otherwise, you shouldn't be interrupting. But all teachers find it very difficult to do nothing, to actually hold back and restrain themselves, because they're paid to teach. They have a vocation to teach. So that's a problem. And then the opposite, contradictory side of that is that it's easier with a course book, isn't it? Let's face it. I mean, life is just so much easier. You arrive in class and it's page 72, and it's a good course book. There are good course books now. There are marvelous mega course books that do everything for you. So you except brush your teeth. Everything else is all thought of. So. To which the answer is, I think that some of the newer course books do lend themselves to being used in this way. because the idea of can-do statements has come in, the idea of culminating tasks. It's not exactly revolutionary. The issue is how you allow the students to exert their agency during this process of working towards a cumulative task. So I think that, those are probably the two main reasons. And then there's a third reason in Europe. I'm less familiar with the teacher training situation in Canada, but it may be reflected here as well. And that's the fact that in experience in Europe, the primary school teachers don't have a problem understanding what an action-oriented approach is because they do it all the time. Similarly with secondary teachers who are generalists. So, for example, in Switzerland, where I live, the traditional system is that a class has 2 teachers over a period of 4 years. One does the sciences, the other does the arts, the humanities. This has broken up a little bit over the past few years, but there's still this basic idea that you have and they're generalists. And they also tend to pick up on these kind of ideas because it's a holistic approach. And teachers who are generalists have a tendency to go for a holistic education. Whereas language specialists, who are language specialists? Language specialists are people who liked French at school. What did they like about French? Well, part of what they liked about French was the subject called French. That means they liked the way it was taught, presumably. So then they go to university and they study French, in Europe anyway, they go to university and they study French in a department called French, but actually it's literature. It's literature and people doing very strange research on, the use of the expression il y a in Baudelaire, or something, right? Which has nothing whatsoever to do with language teaching. And they find this fascinating because this is, what they really liked about French as a school subject. And then they go through a year's brainwashing at some pedagogical institute, or if they're unlucky, 2 years. They may even believe this stuff and say, hey, I've been converted. Yes. Then they go into a school and they discover that everybody is teaching the way that they themselves were taught. And they think, oh, okay, right. And so it's phenomenally difficult to achieve change in language teaching in the upper secondary schools, if you have them. Because unlike in other subjects, or I'm not so sure I shouldn't say that, but certainly in our subject, the people who become the specialists often have very little interest in pedagogy.
And I have in mind the other part, which is linked to this idea. It's, although people say they kind of refuse this idea of behaviorism, etc., but there is still this idea that the more you're exposed to the language, the more you will learn, which is a bit the same as we said before, no? The input equal intake, the more time equal more learning. And this is, we know that it's not true, it has been demonstrated. It's much better that you understand why, or you notice certain things, but this is still there. So even for teachers who are not obliged and are willing to change, there are these preconceived ideas that somehow stay and are enforced in the society. If you read general newspapers, it's incredible how much they are repeated. It's a mantra that is repeated. Oh yeah, you needed to be immersed. There is no other way, or this kind of things. Yeah. Yeah.
And I think there's a fourth element to that. It's the resistance and even the reluctance of the learner himself or herself to become an agent in the classroom. That's what I've seen in my experience as well. But my question actually was also about the role of the native speaker, and traditionally how the native speaker has been held as the ideal in language learning. So how is this notion integrated in the action-oriented approach, especially in a plurilingual?
Yeah, I'm happy to say that the native speaker is dead. To announce that, because basically, what is a native speaker? There are so many. Look just at Toronto. How many native speakers there are? They couldn't be more different, and luckily so, I would say. So this idealization of a native speaker, which is still, again, is still out there, is still in the newspaper, is still in the common idea, in the job profiles, etc. It's terrible. It's another gatekeeper that has, plus it has gone from the linguistic point of view to now more, it's a problem of social justice, because we realize increasingly that the notion of native speaker is totally invented, but it's still very powerful there. So it's something, again, I personally think that needs to be deconstructed with the students, but also with the teachers, because as you say, I see very often, and I've seen in my career, teachers whose they teach a second language, they never feel good enough. Yeah. But their language is fantastic. Of course they make some mistakes, who doesn't? But they still have this complex of, oh, my French is not good enough, my German is not good enough, I don't dare, I pass mistakes to my errors to my students, and I wish you did, because you would pass good things alongside the mistakes, but it's not so. There's this idea of the native, in a kind of native speaker that has entered. It's like when in Germany, after the wall of the fall of the Berlin Wall, they said that the Mauer is in Kopf. It's in your head, in your mind. Well, the native speaker is in your mind, and it's difficult to take it out. Yeah.
I mean, it's even in the minds of the learners.
Sure.
Yes. Oh, yeah.
Sure.
Like they will never be good enough.
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah,
it's connected with the Chomskyan idea of an idealized competence. It's connected with the age-old, the 19th century idea of bilingualism, that it means a perfect, bilingualism, because you were born, you learned both languages from the cradle, and it's linked to the idea that your brain is a vessel. I have an 11-liter brain. How big is your brain? And it linked to all of those things, and in our which are all ridiculous. And in our terms, the issue is, is the native speaker what people are aiming for? This idea. There was at one point a concept of interlanguage, which is what people do on the way to presumably becoming native speaker-like. Well, I mean, even 20 years ago, the CFR did not use the native speaker at all as the endpoint of what was considered to be what people were aiming at. We're not trying to, language learners are not apprentice native speakers. I mean, it's a ridiculous idea. They are learning to become proficient speakers, which is not the same at all. And then secondly, there's the issue of, okay, if we all agree about that, well, we still need it. This is Alan Davies was very fond of this. Alan Davies is one of the greatest applied linguists in the British tradition. He more or less founded the discipline of applied linguistics, actually, come to think of it. He was very fond of the idea of the native speaker saying, well, in the end, what's the point of comparison? Well, the answer is, the point of comparison is usage in Toronto, right? Usage. It's usage. It's not a person, whether or not they were born with this language. It is the question of what is said in Toronto. So I personally, as not being a Torontonian, I find it impossible in this building to tell who is a native speaker of English and who isn't. I mean, I find it impossible because of the fact that the Canadian accent is a much easier accent to acquire than, say, a British accent. And so, in fact, the solution, it is very difficult to know in Canada who is born here and who isn't. And that's how it should be. Because it's an achievable comprehensibility that people can actually reach, and over a period of time, let's say 300 years' time, you'll probably find that English has moved much further in that direction.
I have a question from somebody who said in French, je voudrais poser une question concernant la part du grammatical, du linguistique dans la réalisation de la tâche, qu'elle soit pédagogique, communicative ou réelle, sociale. So, where is the language and where is grammar in the task? Well, this was a big misunderstanding of the communicative approach, and even more, that grammar had to disappear. No, not at all. This idea, the language, grammar, etc., doesn't disappear, but it's not the backbone of the curriculum. It's really what you need in order to accomplish the task, and it can be done afterwards. It can be done partially before in that input that Brian mentioned, but it must basically become something that you notice while doing, after doing, that you systematize. So it's absolutely not gone away because you improve your level. You can do tasks when you are at an A2 level, but then you can do the same task at a much higher level, of course in a more sophisticated way. That means that your linguistic competence has grown up and your knowledge also of grammar, etc. But so you need to understand why, what are these two things, but at the same time, it's not the queen of the entire teaching. If you look at lots of curricula now in the books, although they look very nice and they have online elements, etc., but in reality, the driving force of the curriculum is the progression of the grammar. That's what it is, and then it's very nicely made up with a lot of other stuff.
Yeah, it's not grammar that's been got rid of. It's the rigid progression of working through things in a particular order, which is invented anyway.
Yeah.
Because it's not based on any real research. I mean, attempts to prove it through natural orders of acquisition and all of this stuff have really not been very successful. But I mean, there is a kind of regression, because if you're basing all of this kind of approach on objectives, they are functional objectives, but the way that it all works, because this whole system of whether you're talking about the Canadian language benchmarks, ACTFL, or the CFR, these systems of can-do statements are based upon a collective experience over decades of expert teachers. And so there is an understanding of what people can do at different levels, which is not entirely unconnected to what grammar they can handle. It's not, at least up until you get to a CFR level B2, or which would be a CLB level 8. I mean, until you get up there, there's a fairly close relationship between what you're doing functionally and the grammar you're acquiring. So it's not as if there is no progression. It's that you're not fixating on progression. You're doing it indirectly. You're using the can-do statements to give you the progression, and you're dealing with the language, the grammar, as it comes up in the tasks, and just checking that you're actually covering whatever you have in the back of your head as a grammatical syllabus over the course of the school year. I mean, that's basically the issue. And then the second issue is that about grammar is that most of the time, I mean, I'm trying to learn Italian. I'm brilliant at doing little exercises, but translating it into using it in reality is completely different. The only thing which really works, frankly, is when you use language for something which is personally meaningful in the process of creating something. It doesn't matter what it is you're creating. It may just be a letter you have to write to the electricity board. It doesn't matter, but it's the fact that you have used this language for that purpose, and then it goes, something happened and you remember it. Of course you have to practice exercises as well, but the problem is you never remember from the exercises. You need to use the language in a personally meaningful way, and that's the whole concept of the action oriented approach. So it's not that there's no grammar, it's that people remember grammar if they use it in a meaningful way.
Est-ce que vous avez compris? J'espère. Sinon, je peux après faire une petite synthèse.
So my first first thing, I'd like to make a comment. I am using the book for my dissertation, and I find it both comprehensive but at the same time very approachable. So that has really changed.
Thank you.
Some concepts that are scary, they're actually well described. So that's beautiful. As I try to understand and try to explain to others the difference between the communicative approach and the action-oriented approach, a few things come to mind, and I'd just like to see if I'm in the right direction. To me, a communicative approach has a formula that as you say, a straitjacket, that here's the formula, apply it so we can reach a specific goal. It's very different than a task where there's that allows a person to, like you said, the elbow room, in order to dig into whatever repertoire we have available, whether it's plurilingual, pluricultural, or within the language itself, in order to create meaning, and that's the added component, which is creation of meaning, not achieving the goal, which is a very different thing. And I find that there might be some resistance in the fact that there needs to be a comfort level in the student that the achievement of this task or the final goal, it may take a very different direction, because the repertoire and the strategies that the student and the instructor is using is not as controlled, not as contrived, that it may take a very complex route. As in the communicative approach, it's kind of fed step by step, and so there's in a sense less freedom, and with that we need to have a little bit more comfort in knowing that it will go in directions that is not linear and that is very different and unique within each student.
Yeah, no, you're perfectly right, and that's what maybe what is also a bit scary, that the fact that it's not already planned. Planning doesn't mean that you plan exactly what you know already what they are going to produce. You have an idea, sure, because it's a genre that they will be probably working with, so you have an idea, but it's not so clear, because they have this room for developing in a little bit of a different direction. So in a sense, it's like somebody said that the communicative approach is like the language for the tourist, whereas the action-oriented is the language for living in a country. And in reality, it's like that. In the communicative, it was this idea of making a role play and pretending you are somebody and the other. And it was not this meaningful for you. It was visibly done because you wanted to make an exercise a more meaningful one on something. But you have to connect with the action-oriented approach. The idea is connecting, and connecting through your own culture and your own context and your personality, your family, your community. All this, for example, when we talk about culture, in the communicative approach, there was this idea. Culture was, if you studied French, you learned stuff about France. It was the civilisation. For us, France, maybe here it was about Quebec, I don't know. But the idea is that you are basically, it was the absurd situation that you asked the student who knew nothing about the country of the target language, to discuss and talk about that. Whereas it would have been much more significant for them to talk about their own culture, their own community in the language that they were learning, and to maybe help somebody else discover their culture, their community, etc. And we've seen in the LinkDeal project, as soon as the students in the heritage language, as soon as they could go into projects that were somehow linked to their origins, they were absolutely fascinated, and they went beyond what we asked. In some heritage language classes, they said, I would have never thought that for my language class I could have, I don't know, even interacted with my grandmother. They had a grandmother back in Bulgaria, and they didn't interact because it was, I studied Bulgarian because, okay, this is my origin, fine. But there was an interest, of course, because there were people doing on top. but it became like, oh yes, I see. And I discovered, and they discovered something of their city through the eyes of the elder person that they couldn't have found in any book, for example.
I mean, when you talk about the communicative approach, one has to make a distinction between what the communicative approach was originally intended to be and what it became. And also that there were there was a British and an American approach which were quite radically different. I mean, there was part of the problems of communicative approach was the belief that if people talk, they will learn. You know, this idea of Krashen type thing that provided that you get stuff happening in the classroom, it'll all happen by itself, which is a bit, a bit problematic. And then the more British approach was based upon needs analysis originally. Well, nobody does needs analysis. I mean, that was the first thing that got sort of thrown out the window. And over a period of time, the initial experimentation with the communicative approach by the mid-80s had reverted back to the idea of textbooks and based on grammatical progression. And so you get the task-based approach as the strong version of the communicative approach, trying to push things on again. But if there is a fundamental difference, I mean, obviously the action-oriented approach is a further development of the strong version of the communicative approach, the task-based approach. The difference, we've tried to point out a few differences, but maybe the fundamental difference is creativity and agency. Whereas there has always been a tendency for things in a communicative paradigm to end up being transactional, to be about shunting information from here to there. And even in supposedly, and organizing everything in terms of topics. In practice, it's topics and information.
Yeah, because that was the move away from just the grammar. Yeah. I have another question here, which is again in French. And the colleague says, les actes de parole n'ont de sens que s'ils s'inscrivent dans le cadre d'action en contexte social. Ce sont vos propres mots, so it's what I've written in some article. Alors, doit-on dépasser le cadre de la classe de langue pour les réaliser? Si tel est le cas, comment peut-on le faire? So, if you say that the speech act don't have a meaning, a sense, only in the social framework, in a social context, then how can we do with the class? My reply that I typed very quickly is, yes, you can open the class even by staying in the class, like the class can be open to the rest of the world because it's not a universe that is outside, is independent from the rest. So even if you are in a class, you are in contact with other people and cultures, etc. And the idea is to invite them into your learning process, and vice versa, to see that the classroom and the wall is down, is transparent. You can go out and continue your learning process.
I would suggest that we
can continue more socially this conversation, because
those people who would like to, there's the gentleman over there who's got the books with a nice discount if you're interested in getting one. And there's also coffee and stuff at the back.
Yeah.
And what we could say is, please feel free to come up and ask questions to us individually. And maybe we could, with the hardy few who are still here in half an hour's time, we could maybe convene again for any last question.
Yeah.